Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tresle webinar. My name is Joel Keeler. I'm the CEO of Tresle. I have a very exciting presentation for you all today. Before I get started and introduce today's guest, I want to briefly cover kind of an overview of what we'll be covering today. Most people associate being an entrepreneur with starting a business from scratch. However, as we all know, startups present a wide range of risks. Entrepreneurship through acquisition is a term that is used to describe the process of buying an existing business, taking it over, and operating it as the CEO. And this will kind of be the center of discussion for today. We plan to cover kind of what the benefits of this approach are, what common mistakes people make in this process, what some of these transactions look like, and much more. So today's format is going to begin with an interview with our guest, then we're going to transition to a Q&A with questions that people pre-submitted through social media. So thank you in advance to everybody that did that, followed by a brief close. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure of introducing Jan Simon, co-founder and managing partner at Vonzeo Capital, a firm that invests globally in search funds and their acquisitions. We're going to talk about what that is a little bit later on in the show. Prior to this, Jan worked for about 2 decades in the investment industry, holding notable positions at Salomon Brothers and Goldman Sachs, and was a member of Merrill Lynch's hedge fund advisory firm. Since the early 2000s, he's been teaching at graduate schools in Europe, in the US, and in Canada, and is the academic director of the International Search Fund Center at IESE Business School in Barcelona, where he's based right now. The Economist ranked him as one of the top 20 business school professors in the world. And fun fact, he also served the 1st Battalion of Parachutists and Commandos, as well as NATO's Special Intervention Forces. He holds both the Commando A and Parachutist A military certificates. So thank you so much for joining us, Jan.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Joel.
Great. So, entrepreneurship, let's kick this off. Entrepreneurship through acquisition isn't really a new topic per se, but I think it might be pretty new to some of the audience. So maybe let's start by explaining, what broadly this topic is.
I think it started back in the 80s already with the idea that you can kill and hunt and kill what you're going to eat as a metaphor, where you have people who have the idea of being CEO as well as shareholders of a company and try to look for that. So they search, they have a search phase. They're looking for companies with certain characteristics and industries with certain characteristics to finally acquire a company and then becoming its CEO. Now, as you already alluded to, there are different formats, of which search funds is one of them, and probably the best well-known one. But the essence of entrepreneurial acquisition or entrepreneurship through acquisition is that one can be an entrepreneur/CEO by acquiring a company and running it.
Okay, so you touch on search fund. So I would say, kind of broadly speaking, entrepreneurship through acquisition is going out and purchasing a company, an existing company, and running it. What's a search fund? How does that differ from just using my own capital, for example?
Yeah, a search fund was actually invented back mid-80s by a person called Irv Grousbeck. And Irv had been an incredibly successful entrepreneur, building Media One, the cable company, Continental Cable, and then had sold out and had become a visiting professor or professor of management practice at Harvard Business School. And so he looked at the space at the MBAs at Harvard, and he thought there was something missing. He saw people going to banking, people doing the startup, people joining a consulting firm, but he didn't see anybody buying and running a firm. And nevertheless, a lot of the MBA cases that were discussed were senior management decision-making, and none of them was, or most of them were not doing so. And his hypothesis was double. He said there's probably 2 reasons why people do not go out of Harvard in that case and acquire companies to run it, is because people do not have the money and people do not have the experience. And so the search fund model, which is the most famous model with MBAs and previous MBAs or business school students, acknowledge for the fact that most people who want to become CEO at a very young age, in this case, the average search fund acquired is about 32 years old, and he does not have the experience and does not have the money. And so what the search fund contraption is, it's actually a vehicle where about 15 investors give money to a searcher or a team of searchers for 2 years to find a company, acquire a company, and then ultimately run the company. And so that is the search fund contraption, is that in the search fund, the searching for a company is also financed by other people. The acquisition is also financed by other people, while the CEO who looks for the company, will have a certain percentage at acquisition, typically another percentage over the next 4 years of running the company successfully, and upon successful exit, have another percentage. And so well done as a single searcher without putting any single dollar. A single searcher can walk away with 25% of the company. For a team of searchers, then it can be up to 30% of the company.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So whether taking the search fund approach or not, what are some of the benefits of, let's say, just entrepreneurship through acquisition compared to, say, if we're comparing it to starting a business, or even if we're talking about kind of that end goal of being a CEO, climbing the corporate ladder. So tell me about kind of the benefits of this process.
It's just another space within entrepreneurship, and a startup entrepreneur is somebody who's really creative, innovative, and really gets his or her kick out of creating something out of nothing. Before the startup entrepreneur, there's nothing, and then all of a sudden there's Google, there's Amazon, or whatever. It's really going from 0 to 10. Okay, typically that's what most startups do. Most startups entrepreneurs don't become Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Sergey Brin. So they go from 0 to 10. Becoming a CEO is almost taking something from 1,000 to 1,100. While an entrepreneur acquirer will be taking something at 100 and bring it to 300. And so it's of a different scale. Okay. Yeah. The bigger the company becomes, the more the grander it becomes, the more difficult it is to move it. So it gets its own momentum, and in that momentum there's all of value. But it's also not that easy to become entrepreneurial. Okay. While if there's nothing, it's very easy to become entrepreneur. And so I would say entrepreneurial acquisitions is a little bit midway, where you become a CEO. You don't run Procter & Gamble, multi-billion-dollar company, but you run something which typically has sales about $10-15 million.
Okay, amazing. So, we kind of talked about typically who, at least on the search fund model, who these folks are. I would assume that just broadly speaking, entrepreneurship through acquisition can almost be anybody who has some sort of experience or has aspirations of becoming a CEO. But let's talk about the companies themselves. So, obviously, there's a wide range of industries, but in your experience, what are the types of businesses that are typically searched for in this process, and why? I'm sure they have certain characteristics that are maybe an average or commonly looked after.
That is correct. And just to put it a step backwards, okay, I think the first thing that a potential entrepreneur acquirer should do is ask what his or her competitive advantage is. Because if you're 45 years old and you really helped a couple of companies to turn around, your target will be very different than if you're 30-year-old who's never in a company. Okay, and a 30-year-old will have his or her competitive advantage, and the 45-year-old will have his or her competitive advantage. And it's understanding where you are in this spectrum that you want to go for. Now, search funds in particular have been incredibly successful, and the reason of that is because from very early on, under people like Irv, we have come to this model by looking at risk, and where we take the risk, and it's a long way to come to your answer, but I think it's essential. Where we take the risk is to put somebody who's never run a business to become CEO of a company. And to do that successfully, what you want to do is you have to reduce all the other pocket of risk, amongst them, the industry. And so when we look at industries, what do we like to see? We like fragmented industries, which means there's no leaders, there's not a couple of big players and then a whole bunch of small players. Fragmented industries. Industries which are either lowly cyclical or non-cyclical. Okay. Industries which are not going through structural change. And if they go through structural change, it's to the advantage of the company they acquire. And industries where the government doesn't play a big role. Obviously, the government always pays law, even if it's just merely by taxes. Yeah. There's industry where government really sets prices or sets the conditions of the industry. We try to shy away from those industries. So typically, those are the 4 important characteristics. And then the 5th one, which we often look at, is an industry which we do not think is going to be disrupted in the near future, because disruption is a totally different kettle of fish and is often done by startups. So we don't want all of a sudden a startup coming to disrupt the industry, and you being placed outside of it. So those are typically the 4 or 5 important industry characteristics which give you a benign platform. Sure. Now, what is then also important in the industry for us is that those industries are growing typically about 50% above the GDP, average GDP growth. So in Canada, we typically look at industries which grow at 7, 8, 9%.
Okay. So if I could summarize, it's almost like with a heightened leadership risk due to kind of inexperience or anything like that, we're trying to shrink down company or industry risk, right? And you're looking across a couple different avenues in how you're doing that through, like you were saying, distributed, fragmented marketplace, growth, government involvement, and all those things, right?
Correct.
Nice. Okay. So walk us through, maybe like the 30,000-foot view of the process of, high level from the initial idea of, let's say specifically a search fund. It can be one that you've been involved with or otherwise, from kind of timeline and kind of step by step, from, let's say, this idea that somebody wakes up and says, hey, this is something that I want to do, to, taking over the keys.
Yeah. So I think although this has been very beneficial on average for the people doing it, it's really something, as you say, you would want to do. You really want to come out of bed one morning and say, I want to do this. I want to become a CEO. I want to acquire a company. I want to run a company, and I want to grow as a leader. It really has to come from the inside. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the numeration will follow that. But typically, the process is first figuring out, is entrepreneurial acquisition something for me? Some people rather be the number 2. Some people rather be an operations person. So you have to figure out, who are you? Because, a lot of people think it's great being the boss. It is great, but also the boss is where all the big problems are coming to get solutions. Okay, so it's it's not selling it. So you have to figure out, do I want to do that? Do I want to be somebody who's going to be CEO and acquire a company first? The second question then you ask yourself is, which format do I want to do that? So the search fund model, as we said, is one model, which is typically done by younger people, 30, 35 years old. Okay, but there's also people who are older who do what is called a self-funded search, where they pay for the search themselves. Once they find the company, then typically goes to family offices, which help them and provide them with the finances. Or you have other models, which is called the sponsored model, where people are going to work in a private equity firm, do a search paid by the private equity firm, and when then the acquisition happens, they become the CEO. And that's typically people who have quite some experience, typically around 40. So once you've decided entrepreneurial acquisition, the question is the format, and if you then decide to do the funded search, you go indeed to try to find anything between 12 and 16 investors who provide you around $400,000 if you are an individual searcher, a solo searcher, or around $650,000 if you are a team of searchers, if you are a team of 2 searchers. Once you've closed that acquisition, that fundraising, okay, you get the money up front. So you get the entire $400,000, $650,000 up front. That allows you for 2 years, salary, due diligence costs, traveling, and you name it, okay? And during those 2 years, I will give you the numbers. On average, people reach out to 3,300 companies, okay? And so those are pre-selected companies. This is not just like sending an email to, I don't care which company. No, yeah. These are companies with indeed those industry characteristics, but also company characteristics, high EBITDA margins, growing top line, you name it. So there's a whole bunch of other characteristics, price and so forth that go on with that. And so within that, it's often a succession phase. So that means that you also then reach out to people who are 60 years plus, okay? So you reach out to, on average, 3,300 of those companies, of which you get 256 responses. So less than 1 out of 10 respond to your email, to your letter, to your call, okay? Of those 256 that responded, only 125 are positive responses. Okay, the other half is kind of, leave me, no, this is spam. Don't talk to me.
Yeah.
On average, they have conversations with 25. With 16, they have price conversations. They have 5 LOIs, and to put it in layman terms, it's like being 5 times engaged, because an LOI is just not only signing a document. It's indeed doing due diligence. It takes a lot of work, and something that from both sides, from the seller and the buyer, is not taken lightly. So you do that 5 times to buy one company. So it's a really brutal process to the acquisition. Now that is also the process that prepares you to become CEO, because that's something misunderstood about the search fund process. A lot of people think, okay, the aim, the mission of a search, is to find a good company and a great sector. That's one of the 2 missions. The second mission is that the day you acquire a company, that you're ready to take over the reins. And that process actually helps you in doing that. Then that typically takes 4 to 6 months, the closing of the acquisition. And then indeed you get the keys of the company, which people then run anything typically 5 to 6 years. Some people run it for 25 years or 40 years. So that depends a little bit on what the CEO wishes and how well the CEO does. A lot of people now do it for 5 or 6 years and decide to move on, while others stay in there for until they retire. So that's definitely. Although the decision is often is typically a board decision, in reality it is the CEO that typically wants liquidity or wants to move on.
Nice, awesome. Thank you so much for that. So, what are some of the things searchers or broadly speaking buyers should be aware of in this process? Like, and maybe you can give me an example of we don't need to name names, of course, but somewhere where someone avoided this kind of pitfall. It can be in the search process or just broadly speaking, and then went on to succeed.
Okay, there's a couple of things. First of all, I think and that's the advice that we give to our searchers or people who do that is, when you talk to sellers or potential sellers, okay, you want to figure out 2 things as fast as possible. First of all, are they a real seller? Because most of the people like to know, how much is my business worth? They have time for coffee or something like that. That doesn't mean that they're sellers. Okay, people don't tend to sell good businesses, with no reason. So there typically has to be a reason, like it's sometimes age, it's sometimes disease, it's sometimes that they're really, really tired of doing it. But there has to be a good reason for people to sell. Yeah. So try to figure that out as soon as possible, because you do not have a lot of time. You have 2 years, which is going to pass very fast. Figure that one out. And the second thing to figure out is also see if the valuation is in the same ballpark. If you think you're going to pay 4.5 times EBITDA, and the person selling thinks about getting 5 times sales, that's never going to be in the card. Just move on. Say, listen, we're just too far away. My backers are never going to back that. And if things change from my side, I will let you know. If things change from your side, feel free to give me a call. Okay? Those are the 2 things that you want to learn as soon as possible. And then, to your question, more in detail, then the important part is to create a rapport between the buyer and the seller. Okay, because if the seller is just interested in getting rid of the business at the highest price, then it's just about price. Okay, and that's typically not what we're playing, because we the search fund community tend to be people who create long-term value. And so most of the people who have sold business to search funds, are incredibly proud of having done so, because they've seen what has happened with the business over time. Okay. And so that's important. But to be able to do that, there has to be a rapport of trust between buyer and seller. Okay, and that takes time. Okay, now where it often goes wrong is where that trust is broken. And the number one why that trust is broken are legal documents. And why is because the seller, for most of the sellers that we encounter with, this is the first time that they sell a business. Okay. And so they create that personal report with the searcher, and then all of a sudden, the sales and purchase agreement arrives, or within there, the reps and warranties. And that is lawyers have just another language. What they have to write documents withstands storm and withstands hurricanes. Okay, and it's written in a very specific language. Now, this language, per definition, is devoid of trust. Okay, and so there comes all of a sudden, they have that great report, and all of a sudden those documents come, and it's like
180.
I thought you trusted me, and all of a sudden you have those reps and warranties. And so that's why you have to prepare people for it. That's one. The second reason why we often see deals falling through is because the seller has a trusted advisor, which is not a professional for buying and selling business. Might be, and it's often an accountant, it's often a lawyer, a family lawyer, it's the uncle or whoever. Okay, but this person is not versed in selling business. And so that's why it often goes wrong, because this person, you can get far much more for your business, or are you going to sell it to a young person? You shouldn't do that. Let me handle that. Okay. The best advice that one can give to a person who's going to sell their business is for that person to surround himself with really people, with lawyers and brokers and whatever they want to use, who do this for a business. Okay. Because they understand that language. They understand exactly what should be in the reps and warranties. They can exactly say to the seller, no, it's normal. You will not able to sell your company and getting a check and disappear without having signed reps and warranties. And that's important. That's a second place where we see actually deals falling through. And the third and the last item I would see is where the MBA tries to show off. Okay, and with good reason, with the good intention, like wanting to show that he or she kind of knows, is smart and stuff like that. But that often backfires, okay, because those people who have often built great businesses, they don't have that narrative of MBA students or somebody who might be working for KKR or something like that, and that often works alienating. And just be yourself, just talk normal language, and just try to understand the seller, and I think that will go a long way.
And the seller's likely, if we're talking about this kind of, whether it's age or retirement, maybe a more typical exit, they've likely seen it all. So, probably not going to be overly impressed with that. But you bring up a good point of, I always like to say, you want to look for, obviously we're not going to pretend like price doesn't matter, but it's always kind of interesting. You want to probably look for people who care about who buys their business, because that's ultimately, when you're talking about getting to one of the two things as fast as possible, people who care about their business, who care about who buys their business, that's probably going to echo down the chain, because it's probably that type of person is probably going to treat their employees well, treat their vendors well, treat their customers well. And it's going to be a reflection of the business that you're buying as well, versus somebody who's like, maybe so out of touch with reality in terms of price, in terms of everything. So that's a very, very good point. So, we started talking about, the money that would be raised, but, when the smoke clears and stuff, and, based off of your findings and your experience, what if transactions finally consummated, what are the typical returns, that folks are accustomed to seeing?
Within the search fund community, the returns have historically been around 30-35%. So there's studies going all the way back from 1996, and they have a variance of a couple of percent, but they typically, hover between 30 and 35% annualized.
Wow, that's exceptional.
It is, and what is above exceptional is the persistency of it. And so I did before I came into search funds, I did my research into performance persistency in investing. And you find very little of that. And so for an asset class to keep on performing, that persistently that high, it's really exceptional. And part of it has to do, with the whole contraption of indeed, buying good businesses, great industries, but also, and what is often underestimated is the quality of the boards, and so the quality of the boards that those searchers put together is just amazing. For companies who have 15 million in revenue, they put boards together as some people sit on boards of those companies who also sit on boards of billion-dollar companies.
Sure.
And I think that's part of the secret sauce.
Just bringing in like that kind of next level of professionalism of the business of business, so to speak, and that next level. No, absolutely. So outside of the financial rewards, which are amazing, obviously from what your research and what you're just saying, for the searcher or the ETA, the entrepreneur through acquisition, what are perhaps some of the more intangible, personal, intrinsic rewards of becoming an entrepreneur through acquisition? Outside of the ownership and the money and the returns and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think those really should be secondary. Those returns, are going to come if you do things well, and you're going to do things well if you really do things that you're passionate about it, and you go the extra mile for, and not the other way around. It won't happen. But I think the biggest reward, I think, is growing in leadership. Those are people who start off typically, running companies which have anything between 25 and 40 employees, and often when they left, they have 500-600 companies. Okay, so they really have grown. They really have attracted a lot of great talent. You really have put in a scalable structure and a growing company. And I talking with people, who have now retired out of the search business. If you ask them, like, what are you most proud of? Nobody talks about, what they have on the bank account. It's really having inspired people, it's having grown businesses, having delivered better services and better products. The same, and that's I think that's also the main reason why people are happy to sell to those kind of people, because they look around to their predecessors and see what they've done, and how they care about the employees and how they care about growing business and how they go about that. Yeah, I think, and that's what the seller's legacy ultimately is. And so the seller doesn't want to turn 3 or 4 years down the road around and say, well, actually, those people who bought the company, they fired everybody, and they, and they made a lot of money because they put a lot of leverage on it, and they run the company for cash. And now the company is dead. They made a lot of money just by leveraging. That's not what we do, because we long-term investors. And I don't think that typically is what the person selling the business like to see, because they're typically the one who have also hired a lot of the employees, who know the employees, kids by name. Yeah. And so they also, when they sell, they also want to do well by the employees and by the other stakeholders. Yeah, absolutely.
So we're talking about a little bit about, I guess we kind of touched on the price, and what are typically the multiples that are seen in this space that you operate in?
Yeah, we typically see between 4 and 6 times EBITDA, and of course it depends on the company, the growth, and the margins, and what have you. And then for SaaS and software businesses, we typically see between 2 and 4 times ARR. Okay. Because we use not the multiple for those kind of businesses, as they are high growth businesses. I don't think a seller, would like to focus on the EBITDA, but the ARR and sometimes ARR plus NRR. So ARR being annualized recurring revenue, and then NRR is a non-recurring revenue, and so hence we typically pay a multiple of that.
Okay, and that's for software-related companies, you said?
Software or SaaS companies, which have very, very sticky revenues and have high growth.
Got it. So you kind of touched on the profile of a lot of these entrepreneurs through acquisitions, and I would assume it's, as we were talking about, kind of probably typically first-time business owners. In your experience, what is the learning curve of taking over the keys, and kind of how is the transition period managed post-close?
Yeah, so what we advise searchers always is, we buy good companies. Okay, and so if the seller says, like, oh, what are you going to do with my business? Typically the answer is nothing. Okay, the first year and a half, we want to take over businesses, that almost don't need leadership. That things are going well. Okay. Yeah. And that year and a half is used for 2 things: for the new CEO to become CEO, and as well as for the new CEO and the board to figure out what they're going to do with the company. Therefore, and so typically what you see, if you look at the EBITDA or even the revenue, you typically see, a nice upward sloping, curve. Then there's the acquisition, and that more or less stays on, that the angle almost stays intact for the next 2 years, and then it kicks in. And in the great ones, it kicks in and it goes for 25, 30 years. Okay, you take an example like Assyrian, Assyrian has a hockey stick that has gone on for 25, 30 years. The same thing with Carry On, and you name it, okay? And why is that? Because, too many times, if you see sometimes do that just for fun, they take over and we say like, okay, if you would have to change the company, what would you do? Oh, we'll do this and we'll do that, and then a year and a half down the road, they said, no, it's a good thing we didn't do that. Because now that we know the company, now that we know and understand the industry, we think that the strategic opportunity is right here. And so let's now organize or reorganize the resources of the company to deliver on that. And that's why, that hockey stick then typically kicks in. And so typically you get after a big change after year 2 to 3 it starts. And then year 5 to 7, you get another one, because at 5 to 7, you get incredible deleveraging of the risk.
Yeah.
Because, I said, the way to look at this from risk, low risk industry, the lowest company, and you put the risk in, in the search, not somebody who's never done it. And then you provide a great board. Okay. You take the same search or the same industry, the same company, 5 years down the road, that's not an inexperienced CEO anymore.
Yeah.
That's now an experienced CEO, which is still in a great industry with a fantastic company. Okay. Yeah. And that's why you get those high returns.
Yeah. And a very narrowed in experience of that company, knows the ins and outs, very much understands in industry from having their hands in the mud, so to speak.
Correct. And that's why when there's leverage to be taken or there's mergers and acquisitions to be done, that's typically between year 5 and 7, because we have the experience of the search, we understand the industry, and we now become a meaningful player within a fragmented industry.
Yeah. Awesome. So why, in your opinion, should somebody consider pursuing entrepreneurship through acquisition?
I would say because they want to be CEO, they want to take leadership positions, and they want to inspire and grow people. I think, that has to be the reason why you want to do this, to create value for all stakeholders, not only for shareholders, but also, for employees, also for the suppliers, also for the clients. Okay. And so if that's why you want to do this, and as I said it the other day, as you said in a nice way, I'm kind of getting old because I've done all those stuff in my life. But I know quite some of my friends, who work in big companies, and they just tired of that. They said I really would like to be, the CEO of a small company. How good would that be? I don't know anybody who's a CEO, in a medium-sized company who said oh, I would like to be mid-management in a big conglomerate. I don't know anybody. I don't know anybody. I never met anybody like that. If you're a CEO and you're good at it and you grow it, I think it's the best thing that there's out there, which brings us back to an earlier point. Okay, if you're in that position and you're enjoying that position, why would you sell a good company? Okay. And so typically there has to be a good reason, because people don't sell good companies if they're CEO and things are going well. Yeah,
absolutely. Isn't that true? Giving up, something that you built and almost your identity to be kind of, not to say that people working at big companies don't do meaningful work at every single day, but it almost the impact of your decisions likely don't go as far as the decisions of kind of running your own shop, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also about the DNA, It's we often see that when we see teams, we often try to figure out who's going to be CEO, and you often you ask them the question, and you often hear the number 2 saying he's going to be the CEO, she's going to be the CEO. I don't want to be a CEO. Yeah. And I think it's such a blessing if you from yourself know who you are and where your skills are and what makes you happy, and you go for that, and so and those people are often great at being the COO, the CFO, whatever they decide to do by the CEO position. Yeah.
So before embarking on their journey, what are important questions that, because look, we were just talking earlier saying you reach out to thousands, you get hundreds, you get dozens, then you get a handful, and then you end up with one. So to me, that reads like you have to have thick skin. You have to be used to a lot of failure and feeling like you're running up against a dead end and so on. So, what should people look in the mirror and ask themselves? Obviously, we talked about kind of what the identity is, but almost like what does it take, and who are the ones that typically do well? What attributes do they carry?
Yeah, when people ask me that, as you said, I do some teaching also. But when people talk about the next step in the professional life, I always try to tell them like there's a Venn diagram of 3 circles that you try to achieve, and one is skill. What are you good at? Okay, because I always wanted to sing, but I cannot sing even if my life would depend on it. For me, I'm going to become a professional singer. It's just silly. So people say that you can do anything what you want to do. No, you can't. We have a defined number of skills. Okay, that's number one. But also we have a defined number of passions. Okay, and so you often see that people who are really good at that, they're often passionate about it. And why? Because you can go the extra mile. Things don't seem like long. You really want to get into this. In a sense, try to find something where the circle of skill and passion overlaps, okay? But then also try to have the overlapping with things that society values, okay? And to give an example, Van Gogh was passionate about painting, and he was really skilled at painting, but at that time, society didn't acknowledge that. It never sold a painting, never was able to make money out of that, okay? So you want to find those 3 circles together. Now, society values people who are in business as well. Okay, so ETA, is good for that. Okay. Now the question is like, do you have the skill set that overlaps with the passion in doing that? And that is, are you happy to solve problems? Are you happy to have days which are difficult? Okay, because that means that you don't take things personal. When you get 3,600, sent out, and you get 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 12 answers. Like, how does that feel? Does that feel like rejection, or do you say that's part of it? That's part of what I have to achieve. Like, how do you respond to that? How good are you inspiring people? Okay, how good of a salesperson are you? Okay, and again, a lot of things you can also work on. If you're passionate about something, some things you can get better on. So most of the people we get, either come from the deal making, so they either have been bankers, consultants, or come from private equity, or they have been operational people. Now, within that, you have to be able to do both. So that's one of the great things about the model, that nobody is perfect. That's why you use also those 2 years to become CEO ready. So there's stuff you can work on. If it's convincing people, you can work on that. It's becoming better at sales, you can work on that. If you understand the numbers, you can work on that. And hence, you want to be able to do that. But if you don't enjoy doing that, then it's probably not your path.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good way of putting it. So, if somebody wanted to learn more about this topic, what resources would you recommend for people to just kind of get their feet wet, read, listen, educate themselves, maybe specifically about search funds?
Sure. So there's two big research centers on the topic. So I talked about Irv, the guy who invented it all. After 4 years, he left Harvard for Stanford, and so that's why search fund now in North America is really associated with Stanford, and so it falls in Stanford under the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies. So if you just type in Center of Entrepreneurial Studies, Stanford, you'll see on that web page you have a whole bunch of documents. The most important document on search funds is called the primer. Okay, and so you can look for the primer of Stanford. They just ask you to give your email and your details, and you get the document. It's about 90 pages long, plus another 90 page of addendum and legal documents. It's probably the best that is out there. But there's also some other documents. Now they cover North America. The rest of the world is covered by IESE. So that's where I am the academic director. So you can also put IESE. And then search funds, and then you come to the search fund page there, and you find a whole bunch of other documents on incentive structures, or what to do in a crisis, or what have you. So there's a whole bunch of documents there. Now there's also, I just said, there's I run a fund that's called Vonzeo. So if you go to vonzeo.com, we have an info page where you have all the important documents together. Actually, I think it has the most important documents from the Stanford website as well as from our IESE website, and some additional data on that. As I think I also shared with you, I wrote a book on the subject, which is probably going to come out next month.
Yeah.
And I have three co-writers. So it's Peter Kelly from Stanford, it's Simon Webster from London's Business School, and Rob Johnson from ESN. So the four of us, me being the lead author, we wrote a book on it. But that has a lot of input from the entire community. So you'll find little anecdotes or little snapshots from different people within the industry.
And where will people be able to find that once it is published?
Well, it's going to be on Amazon, so it's going to be called Search Fund and Entrepreneur Acquisitions. On Amazon, you'll be able to find it.
Amazing, thank you. Well, that kind of completes the interview portion of the discussion. Now we're just going to switch over to some of the prompts and questions that we received from social media. And like I said, thank you to everybody that submitted. We actually got a ton of inquiries, so we couldn't apply to everybody, but let me pick some of the ones that are maybe most applicable. So at a simple butterfly asks, how do you choose which company or business to buy, and how do you determine the cost or value to offer to buy?
So how do you determine the company to buy? And so we already talked a bit about those company characteristics, but I think there's two questions that searchers don't often ask or don't ask enough. The first question, I already alluded to, what is your competitive advantage? Because don't forget, you will have to convince a seller to sell the company to you. And people will only sell the company to you if they want you to have that company or to own that company. And therefore, you have to sound knowledgeable about the industry, knowledgeable about the company, about the competition, and what have you. And so, if you, for instance, spend 4 or 5 years in education, or if you have really passion about education, you'll be able to talk passionate with the seller in a digital education business if that's what you want to go for. Okay, and so I think that would be a question I ask, like, why would somebody sell to me? What do I have, me as a person, to offer? It's very unlikely that other searchers come to the same company because there's so many companies around there.
Yeah.
But just do the exercise as if there would be like a competition between you and 2 other searchers. Why would they sell to you? I think that's one question that is not asked enough. The second question that a lot of searchers don't ask enough is, who am I going to sell this company to? Because you have quite some companies which have high growth, a high margin, okay? And typically you find a whole bunch of them which are already for sale, okay? But the question is, okay, you can take this company, it has 12 million, and in 5 years from now it has 50 million. Who is going to buy that company for you? And so ideally, you have a good narrative, a good explanation why some competitors might want to buy it, why private equity might want to buy it, why some suppliers might want to integrate their company with this. Because if you don't have competition for that company of 4 or 5 years from now, the whole exercise is not going to work out, nor for you nor for your investors. Okay, and have to have a little bit of focus on that. I think that's also the advantage again of the search firm. By the way, you have typically about 15 investors which will guide you in that. Okay, yeah. You'll try not to be too hands-on because this is you're driving the train. They're kind of the passengers. But if you go to kind of sectors of companies that really don't make sense, they will let you know. And as I said, some people come from the deal making and they're pretty good at valuation, but that's also the easiest what your investors can help you with. Investors will look at the company, will look at the characteristics, and they'll tell you, like, I will not pay more than 5 times EBITDA for this company. Or they say, like, this company looks really, really good. It has great features. It is already of a bigger size, and hence a higher multiple is justified. It has some IP, and so maybe for this company we can pay 8 or 9 times EBITDA. Okay, and so it's very difficult if you were just saying like, 4 to 6, valuation is a little bit more subtle than that. But again, that's something that your investors can really help you with.
And I think this is not part of the question, but definitely maybe a later discussion. But kind of going about the raising, it would definitely be an advantage of who you're raising money from, who those investors are. So if it's 15, how they can help you in that. But maybe that's a discussion for a later time. This is a great, it's not a question, but I think it's a little controversial, and I like it in that sense. At something I made up, 12 asks, I don't think acquiring a company makes you an entrepreneur. You're basically skipping the hard part. What would you say to somebody like that?
I don't think it's a competition, and I don't think it's semantics. If this person doesn't think that this is entrepreneurship, I think that person is totally free to do that. I don't think people do startup because they want to walk around with a label like I'm an entrepreneur. Look, I'm better than a banker or a banker. No, I don't think it is. And I think, I think innovation is creation and something that is value. I think an entrepreneur is somebody who comes up with solutions, who thinks differently, who moves things, who changes things, and that's why you can have what is called intrapreneurship, which is entrepreneurship in big companies, and you can have, that with startups, but taking a business which on average has 10 million in sales and growing to 50 million sales over 5 and 6 years and doing a return of 30 to 35%, which is higher than the average return of startups. The average return of startups is about 20%. I take my head off that for every day of my life for the people who do that. If you want to call them entrepreneurs, you want to call them something different. I don't think it will keep them awake. It definitely doesn't. It definitely does not keep me awake. I think that's just semantics.
Yeah, great answer. At 8 Cups of Coffee asks, what's a typical deal structure for the transition period? I've read some in-depth articles that indicate that these types of deals typically have the previous owner or seller stay on for months or even years to facilitate the transaction. How does this look?
Okay, I think that's a great question. It's a super interesting question, because what we typically see, and there are some exceptions, is that the seller has the intention to stay around for a longer time and more intensively than it really happens. Okay, and that's good. That's not a bad thing. But it's because the seller sees a young person, and also the seller is a bit insecure about leaving the company, because all big decisions have been taken by the seller, and so that's why you have that feeling like, okay, I just don't want to give that company up. I want to be involved, kind of stuff. Okay, and then 2 things happen. First of all, the seller actually see that the board is a really, really seasoned board, and actually the searcher does quite a good job, and that puts them at ease. That's typically one thing that happens. The other thing that typically happens is the seller now has really, for the first time, quite some liquidity and quite some cash, and the seller's wife or the seller's husband says like, why did you sell the company if you're going to spend 12 hours again on it? Okay, and then little by little you actually see that the seller is disintended for the company. And so what in our experience works best is where the seller stays on a consulting contract. Okay, and so they agree typically for a year consulting, and they get a certain amount of money for that, and they're on call. And so in the beginning they go to all board meetings, or there's an important client to be met, and the former owner has a great relationship. Well, they come along. All of a sudden there's an issue, let's say a tax issue, they can come overboard. Okay, so that tends to work well. What doesn't tend to work too well is where the seller really is still there. Okay, because then you have 2 CEOs. It might be that the seller doesn't have the CEO title anymore, but hey, I was hired by the seller. The seller has always been the person who takes the decision. And so there's now 2 offices with that new kid, and then with the seller. Who will I go to? Okay, and that's one thing. Secondly, the kid says, to put it, I'm just putting that up to really make it. The kid said, okay, do this, but the owner, previous owner, says, don't do that. What do I do now? Okay, and so what we typically help to do is for there to be a really physical transition in day one, where the seller really starts talking about what is happening, why they're selling and stuff like that, and then moves on to the searcher operator, who then takes over the work, and does the entire Q&A, and then the seller actually really disappears for the employees. It doesn't disappear for the CEO, but it disappears for the employees. Okay, and that's typically the best way kind of to do it. Otherwise, it becomes very confusing.
Almost a more formal passing of the torch.
Exactly. Otherwise, it really undermines the authority and what have you. And also, like in the beginning, if it's not done like that, what you typically see in the beginning, they get along like a house on fire, and then the first big decision is taken by the board and the new CEO. And what happened to the seller? The seller doesn't like it, because the seller So I could have done that, and I don't think that's a good decision. And that's typically when the relation starts, unraveling if they're just too close to each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Last couple here. At I Love Brainstorming asks, what are your thoughts about using or hiring business brokers to help someone to buy a business?
Well, everything depends a bit on the person. I think you have great business brokers which give great lead and do great job. I think that's great. If people do a good job for that, it's the same thing like, I got just the same question about financial advisor earlier today. Somebody said, should I take a financial advisor? No, if the financial advisors do a great job, but there's also a whole bunch of financial advisors who don't do a great job. So, if that's for the right reason, and you don't overpay for that and do a good job, it leads to a company, why not?
Got it. Last one at Natasha_B13 asks, what is the typical hold time for these companies? So that this is something that we did touch earlier. You said some people indefinitely, some people 5 to 6 years. Obviously, the private equity fund model, there is kind of that finite time to return the money to the investors. How is that looked at?
Yeah,
typically.
It's a good question, but before I answer it, it's important to see that you being the CEO, your liquidity and the seller's liquidity are 3 different things. Okay, so it might be that that you stay on as a CEO until you retire. Okay, that does not mean that you will have to wait until you retire to get your 25% in liquidity. Okay, so that's one thing to see. Okay, the same thing. You can stay until you retire in the company. That doesn't mean that the company has the same ownership structure. Okay, and so what you typically see after 4 to 5 years, there's typically the CEO who wants an exit. And if you really ask why do you want to exit, it's because they really become wealthy on paper, and they figure out if I'm not exiting, this becomes that can all go down tomorrow. Okay, and that's the moment to have a discussion with your board, because if it's a liquidity issue, the board will solve that for you. The board will say, okay, you've done a fantastic job. We will vest your 25%, so they become yours. Okay, and now which percentage do you want to sell? You want to sell 10%? We'll sell 10%. Okay, and let's say that's worth 10 million. You get 10 million. You get 10 million, and you keep 15% of the company. So that is issue they solved. At the same moment, the board might also organize an exit, saying, listen, for everybody who wants to sell, we're going to see, if there's a new type of, provider of capital that might come in. Sometimes that might take on more debt. Sometimes that might be private equity. Okay, so those are 3 different decisions. And as a consequence of that, the CEO ultimately, together with the board, because the CEO, serves, as long as the board think the CEO is the right CEOs to have it. Okay. But if the CEO does a great job, the board will not have any incentive to change the CEO. And if the CEO wants to stay in there and wants to get liquidity and maybe new targets or more options, then the board can make that happen.
Got it. Well, thank you to everybody that submitted a social media question. Although we couldn't get to nearly each and every one, your participation is appreciated. I'd like to end, Jan, with seeing if there's any questions around this topic that I neglected to ask, or any messages that you'd like to leave with the audience.
No, I think you rounded well up. The only thing I would say, if that's the way you think about going, and it's true for everything, I think. And in the military, we say, time spent on reconnaissance is seldom wasted. Reconnaissance in this world is due diligence. Okay, and so go to talk with some searchers, go to talk with some operators. One of the things why I fell in love with this model is because it's an incredibly collaborative atmosphere. Everybody here helps everybody. Searchers help investors, searchers. So if you reach out to searchers or operators, they'll take time with you. They'll have a Zoom with you. They'll have a coffee with you, and they'll tell you what they like, what they don't like, which investors have been helpful, which investors have not been helpful, what to look out for, which type of companies are for sale, what the EBITDA multiples that they paid, or whatever questions you might have about how your life will look or what the right thing to do is, they'll be helpful. And so that's maybe what I would add.
Amazing. We touched on it as well, as that you have a new book coming out. find other resources through Stanford or EISE, as well as on Vonzeo Capital. But where can people connect with you online and find you online?
Or you can find me on LinkedIn. Send an invite to LinkedIn, and I'll accept it, and we can easily chat from there.
Amazing, and I'll put the link to your website below as well in the show notes. But yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you covering out the time and providing your insight and experience on this topic.
Anytime. Thanks for doing that.
And yes, thank you. And lastly, thank you to everybody for tuning in and listening in the audience. If you have any questions around buying and selling private companies, check out our tools, resources, and blog at Tresle.com. And lastly, if you have any suggestions for future guests or webinar topics or things you want to know, shoot us an email at hello@Tresle.com. Thank you, everybody, and take care.